wondering if any of you had a chance to there was this little tiny piece of homework that I would suggest that you do, which is to simply go to Google and put your organization's name in the search engine and see what happens. Any of you actually had a chance to do that? It's not mandatory. We'll do it together in a second, if you didn't in particular.
I did, but I'm also curious about, because mine is like saved as my work.
So
yeah. That would impact it, right? I should get like my boyfriend who's not in theater, who doesn't search a lot about theater, to do it and see what comes up on his account.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a savvy comment right there, that Google algorithms know us, quote unquote. So what I get as a result and what you get as a result indeed are not the same thing. However, and I'm always logged in as well. So that is a very, very accurate observation. I'm just going to share my screen here for a moment. And is that, Eileen, that must be the description that Google sends you, right? When you do a search for your own name. That sounds like a pretty satisfying. All right, are we seeing, you're seeing my screen here? It's, so this is a search, just, literally doing a search for crane, like your actual, I think that's your actual company name here. And this is what I get this morning. Other days I get actually a box at the side here. I usually get this. Anybody know what the thing on the side might be, or where that comes from? It's called the knowledge panel. When I did that same search, I think you can see me switching windows here, right? So when I did that same search for SpringWorks, I don't get anything there. That doesn't mean you don't have it. It just means it didn't show up, because this stuff is not foolproof, right? But what we're really interested in is to tie together how Google not just sees your website. So it sees your website, in the main body, like all of this stuff. Hopefully, if I'm doing a search with your actual name, I should be seeing, right? Like, it's very specific. I should be seeing things first and foremost about you, including your Facebook and LinkedIn and whatever else you've got set up, Twitter, stuff like that, Instagram might come up. And in your case, in Crane, you also show up on TripAdvisor, which is awesome. Like, there's clearly some understanding that there's a tourism place sometimes attached to when people are looking for what to do once they're in your town. So it's really helpful if you're an attraction or an event or something recurring to actually make sure you're on TripAdvisor too. So that's great. Now, what's intriguing is the knowledge panel. So this stuff here on the side is called the knowledge panel. How does that work? How does this content get to be here? Anybody want to venture any guesses at all? You see these all the time though, right? Like, you do random searches for who knows what, melatonin, COVID, whatever, hospitals, other arts organizations, and you see these knowledge panels a lot. Now, part of how they get populated, Google has a whole bunch of sources that it uses. One of them might be your website. Another one might be related to the events you put on. And if those events are listed, let's say if you use the Facebook event engine, or if you're selling tickets through certain kinds of ticket agents, like Eventbrite comes to mind, those things get tied in here as well. So Google basically, scrapes information of the internet, and it relates those pieces of information to each other. So as long as it can associate your company or your organization to these pieces of information, it starts to connect those up and generates those relationships. Now, it does that without you knowing that, clearly. and it draws on pieces of information that you may not have any idea where they come from. So for instance, this line here that says theater company in Mississauga, Ontario. Amy, you work with Crane. Any idea where that line comes from?
Maybe from maybe the business page, or it could be in some of our descriptions of our different pages of our website as well. I know that.
Are you happy with being called a theater company?
Other than the spelling of theater, yes,
it's
I am
American.
happy with this, with that.
Yeah. So this line is a line that we don't have any power to change. This is actually a line that at some point a human being at Google wrote. And if you try to change that, you will never be able to. Google does not make that transparent. And so while you have a description in your own, so the other place that this gets populated from, so we set your website, we said if you're using event engines of some sort or ticketing agents that are using that Google recognizes and can tie back to your organization, that'll show up here. So you see there's some event here called Bridges Festival. The other place that this information comes from is a thing called Google My Business. So you have an ability, so you see where it says own this business right here? If I was to click on that, it gives me what is now called the Google Business Profile Manager. And it tells me that it's already been claimed. And chances are it's somebody in your organization that is already claimed the Google My Business or Google Business Profile Manager. So you have the ability to make sure that your hours are accurate here, and you can do that through Google My Business. You can make sure that you can actually add events in that thing. I mean, that's a duplication of effort, but you can actually add events in that as well. And Google would have a very unambiguous way to know that you are you and tie that together. Any idea where these reviews come from? At sort of this here? That is something you can manage. So I can write a review about anything I want to on that's on Google, right? And when you have your Google business profile claimed, you can actually manage these reviews through that, and you can respond to reviews. You know that you can also see it says add photo here. So as a consumer, as a user of the internet, I can actually add photos. Very tricky. I mean, if it's food photography, that's awesome. Every restaurant loves that. If that's a performance of some sort that potentially is proprietary, less cool, right? I mean, maybe cool in your context, but you end up, sometimes you kind of go like, that's a rights management issue. We know that there's some musicians that will not allow photography within their shows, right? And they try to enforce that. Good luck with everybody having a phone. Anyway, all to say, when you have this Google panel, when you have that panel sorry, I should call it the Google My Business consistently. That is part of what generates this knowledge panel. You can also add photos to that. So you can start to shape what people actually know about you. Now you see the little map interface here? So the other place that this information is generated by is because there's a physical address. Google also ties Google Maps into this. So there's a lot of pieces of information that Google ends up in a simple database. That's called a relational database, as opposed to just columns and rows, where it relates pieces of information that it believes are similar or the same or from the same organization to each other. And it can generate this really powerful view of you. And then it gives you your Twitter and Facebook profiles, and then it gives you other things that people may have searched for or things that are similar to. So from a web user standpoint, if you haven't claimed this knowledge panel for your organization yet, I highly recommend you do. It gives you a lot more. It doesn't give you complete control because Google will do what Google does. And we're not in charge of the algorithms that it uses, and we're not in charge of its database, right? All we can do is try to feed that database the information we believe is relevant about ourselves. So you do that on your website very clearly. right? You do it when you put tickets on sale, depending on what engine you use in particular. And you do it whenever you post photos that you actually tag properly. If they're not tagged, then they're not that useful. So all of these things come to play, and you also do it when you start to own your business profile on Google, which is a huge part of this. Now, Amy, not to pick on you or anything, but do you know where this piece of text is coming from?
No, I don't.
So this would be the description that is in the description field that Crane Creations added in its Google business profile. So this you have control over.
Okay.
While this you don't.
Okay.
Right. So for a long time, Google wouldn't make that transparent at all, right? It would just have this line, you kind of go like, well, that's almost who we are, but not really. Or if I was saying that, that is not what I would pick out. Right. Like sometimes, the positioning that you're using and what you're doing, there's sometimes a gap, right? So Google will tend to default what it believes you really are doing is, right? So that's not necessarily the kind of marketing you want. But down here, this is actually your words that you get to pick up, and Google will use those and they show them, right? If you were using Google, like the Google post function, all your updates would show up here. Okay, so the first lesson today is this knowledge panel is really important, and the information within it comes from a number of different sources, some of which you control. Does that make sense so far? So far, so good. This over here in the main body of the page is strictly Google search results, right? And we've talked a little bit about Google search when we did the assessment piece at the very beginning of that series, and we talked about that quite a bit when we talked about developing content for your website. Because part of what we were talking about then in a kind of a light way is how Google uses keywords to try to understand your content to some degree, and that keywords is what we use as searchers online, right? I get to put a keyword like puppetry Mississauga into this thing, and what you do some puppetry, right? And we'll see what happens then, and the Bridges Festival shows up. That's actually really good. But all kinds of other things show up, and Crane is number 2 now, and a bunch of other, sort of event listings often end up superseding because they categorically would use puppets or puppetry or puppeteering, while you probably don't. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But you see that there's actually a fairly decent uptake here, and you get Bridges Festival. That's your festival, right, Amy? That's part of Crane?
Yes.
And a few other things start to show up. And as we go down, clearly I added Mississauga here, which is very specific, right? If I added Stratford, chances are I might get Springworks. But if I do a more generic, why don't we try that? There we are. Because I think you might be the only one in the geography, right? And then you get a bunch of related stuff, and then you very quickly in your local newspaper and the Stratford Beacon Herald and stuff like that, right? Stage Store shows up, events listing, I'm sure. So like that's a categorical search, and part of what sometimes happens. So, and that's the piece about where like why would Google show, like when I do that puppetry Mississauga search, I get the Bridges Festival knowledge panel, right? Why does that happen? Why am I not getting Crane? Why is it defaulting to the festival, right? Not a bad question. Like that's where the algorithm makes a whole bunch of choices, and what we have influence over is to give Google as much good information as we can to make sure that the right stuff shows up. But Google does make its own decisions, and we're not in charge of the algorithm, right? And the algorithm does change. And I think in your case, this is probably a really reasonable, like you're probably happy to see this, right?
Yeah, I think that I know at some point we had, I don't know if this page had been, or my business account had been created separate, or if it just appeared and then we just claimed it. Because I think it is useful for us to have both, because it's kind of, they overlap, but they have really different core purposes, sort of.
Yeah. So there are two. You see,
Yeah.
it's claimed already. It's a different email address. The other one started with AD something or other. This one starts with CR something or other. Right. So it's claimed, it's owned. You can always check that if
Yeah.
you get that little own this business. Sometimes I've had instances where the organization had claimed its knowledge panel a while back and staff changes happened, and now you don't have, and you don't know that it's been claimed, and that email address may or may not exist anymore, and even if it does, you may not have the password to get in. So you have to go back through a process with Google to try to reclaim that, and there's a process for that you'll see, where it says request access here. You can try to go through that, and then if there's a problem, you can try to get in touch with Google. It's always kind of tricky. They're not set up to, provide customer services, the other hint that it's claimed is whenever it says from Bridges Festival or from organization, that usually comes from the description field within the Google My Business. Okay. And now the piece, so far so good. Is any of this new to anybody here? In terms of how those pieces fit together?
It's new to me. The question of whether one, clearly Bridges has done and Crane have done this, in terms of it doesn't exist for us, we have not done it, I'm quite certain. So how does one, if you look like this, proceed to do it?
Yeah, that is a great question. So let me just look up the piece I've got for that. There's a few ways to set up your My Business account. Let me just find the thing I set up for that. Just a moment. What's your physical address, Aline?
Our office is 217 Wellington Street.
217
Wellington Street.
In Stratford.
Stratford, yes. The flaw with it is that all of our programming is in multiple locations. And so in terms of what we post on a website at any one time.
Yeah, your events are not your office. Yeah,
no.
Got it. So let me just try to show this to you. I'm going to go back to sharing this screen. One of the quickest, so notwithstanding that your venues are not necessarily your office, it's still helpful to set up that piece, right? So this is your address. This is where you're located, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oops. Hey, look, there you are.
That's because I live there and I teach singing here as well.
And you teach singing. So that's great. So once you zoom in close enough, sorry, I'm just not. Oh, maybe it's because this is out of view. Okay, no, sorry, what I'm trying to do here, maybe it's because I'm in share screen mode. Usually when you right click on stuff, you get a contextual menu. Let me just see if this is gonna work for me or not. Okay, that's behaving funny. Okay, let me show it to you this way. If you do a search for Google My Business, you will get this page. And it basically steps you through how to set up a business page for yourself. Now I'm logged in, so this is my business page for my company. right? So it shows up. If I wasn't logged in, then that wouldn't have shown up. But basically, if you do that search for Google Business Profile or Google My Business, you get this. And when you click on Manage Now, it'll step you through the process to set up your Google My Business profile. If you have a Google account, like I do, you get all, like I'm logged in, right? So you get all of these options, and somewhere you'll see the business profile option. You see the little drop down that happens there? So if you're on this, and then if you scroll down, you see all the other stuff, and then you see more from Google, right? So if you've never used the business profile, it's contextually up where I am on mine because I use it a lot. Okay. For you, it might not show up at all because you've never clicked on it. So if you don't see that little icon up here, just scroll and go to more from Google, and you'll see everything else they do, which is like hundreds of things. Okay. And then all you do is you follow the process. Like it'll step you through the creation process. It's very intuitive. It'll ask you for your address, your company name, email addresses, and all of that stuff. Now, I'm just going to show you this piece here. So I'm in this business profile for strategic moves. That's my company. I'm a consultant. One of the things that Google does is will create these profiles based on the category of business you're in. So if you're a restaurant, you'll get different options on the sidebar, including menu, right? I'm not a restaurant, so I don't get menu. If you're in the event business, one of the tabs you might get might be called events, right? I don't get that as a sidebar option here, but you might. But what you do get is this tremendous amount of information that you have influence over. So I can create posts, like just super easy status updates. I'm running a workshop on November 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern, right? And here's what the workshop is, and I can add a link to that, right? Because as soon as I do that, right, I can actually add a link. It's a direct click through. And next time that somebody searches, for strategic moves, or if you do that at Crane, right, that is one of the things that shows up in your knowledge panel. One of the issues that you run up against with the knowledge panel, the way that they work, is that knowledge panel from a user standpoint is more powerful than the search results. I will pay more attention to it when it shows up than to the search result. Okay. And because it combines this tremendous amount of information about your thing, your event, your organization, right? From my standpoint, the bigger that is, the better, right? So the Bridges one doesn't have a lot in it, but the Crane one did, right? Including your reviews. You've got an event sitting there, which happens to be Bridges. That's great. Hours, right? All of that stuff. And the more of this business thing you fill in, and if you had updates from Crane, this is where they would show up. Like that post I just showed you, that really quick thing about, right? I'm on the homepage of my business account. And I get this, really nice option to do that. I get a one-click thing. I can add photos, right? And it'll just put me into whatever I've got uploaded already. I can add photos from my thing. And you see how it distinguishes things that I upload and things that a customer might upload, right? This is not actually a customer. This looks like a Google shot from the back. 360s, if they exist, videos, right? Interior, exterior, ad work, team, identity. Imagine you're doing a lot of events. This becomes really interesting. Imagine you're a restaurant. Most of the images will be customer food photos, as they should be, right? So this is really quite powerful because this is what starts to shape what's at the top of that knowledge panel are those key photos, right? You saw the map at the top, and then there's 2 photos. That's where they come from. Right? So if you upload your own photos, you get some choice. If you don't like what's here, be aware that Google still doesn't allow you to manage that, what shows up in a super significant way. sometimes it'll take it, sometimes it won't, right? So sometimes if you need to change the image, the only way to, because it's really wrong or really old, the only way to do that is to delete that image out of this area here in your, where you can manage the photos. Which, you know, which is like, again, I'm just in my Google business profile. This is the sidebar navigation. It's really easy to find, right? Most of the stuff that's available, it makes available from your home screen. But you can always, you know, use the navigation and just, oh, look, I actually did one for the conference that we did in November. There you go. Good for me. And you see that, you know, it gives you like tiny amounts of stats for what happens with things. In my businesses, I don't really do marketing. I teach marketing. I don't have to do it for my own business very much. So I use it only to, you know, experiment. So one view is great for me. I don't really get click-throughs. That's fine too. If you're doing a live active event and you're actively promoting whatever Stratford stuff festival or an ongoing event, and you start using this, you'd want to start seeing some traction here, right? You'd want to see some stuff. You get to see it really clearly in an Insights tab. So again, like my personal results aren't huge on this stuff, but it starts to say to you, what is a direct result and what is a discovery thing? So discovery is, you know, when it says, so the direct results would be, I clicked on Crane. The discovery is, I clicked on any of these that show up at the bottom in that panel, right? Where Google has decided those are similar enough to you, right? That somebody who's doing that search might also be interested in those things because they relate by topic and geography, basically. I'm just going to jump back here. So you see, that's what they mean by discovery, right? I didn't search for Crane, but you showed up when I searched for puppetry in Southern Ontario. The other thing that's interesting is this statistic right here. So again, it's low for me, but when I was managing a restaurant here in Whitehorse, you know, I see thousands of these, and the vast majority of results came from maps, not search. Okay, so if you're not on the map, literally, Eileen, you're leaving a lot of traffic on the table, basically.
Apropos of maps, if in our case we present at physical places, can you be on the map in more than one place?
Yeah, you can. Like you may have, like, if I go, like on my business thing, because I used to have an office in Ottawa as well as in Whitehorse, on my very first screen, both showed up, right? So yes, you can be in multiple locations. Let me just see. No, it's all live now. I'm not sure how to get back to that first page. Quickly, right here. You see this right here? So I had more than one location. They were both, you know, verified, both legitimate. So you can use your venues and add them to your own business profile. Absolutely, you can. You just add multiple addresses, and you can edit those, and you can add, you know, add business, add a single import. There's all kinds of options here to help you do that.
So multiples of our partners are like the Gallery Stratford and Venue X, Y, and Z that do other things. So it's a fine that they duplicate, or it's an advantage that they duplicate.
Well, they're just because you happen to be there doesn't mean that they're necessarily managing your event for you, right? Like sometimes they'll have the box office, sometimes they won't, I'm guessing. That would be the scenario often, right? Like if they're presenting you, that's one thing. If you're self-presenting and you're just renting, that's another thing. So it's not that you're duplicating, it's that you're adding venues to your own listing. You're not creating their listing. That's the difference. So it can be a little bit tricky, especially if you want to use their business name as the business name. Google will hiccup on that. If you use your business name and you just add those venues to it, that's what you want to do. You see the difference there, right? Like, don't create the local gallery's profile, but add that physical address and the theater in that, or whatever the space you're using within that. Add that as a venue. Does that make some sense? Okay.
Robin has a question about virtual events or virtual-based business that has no in-person or physical address. And then,
so when you don't have a physical address, Google doesn't like that very much. So I don't, in a strange way, I don't, like, Strategic Moves is an entirely virtual company. Nobody ever comes to my office. My office is in my house. But nonetheless, for me to fully leverage Google, I use my physical address, which is my official office address, to do that. Now, for some people, that's tricky because of the kind of organization you are. It's more difficult without a physical address to really use Google super well, because it kind of demands that of us. Are there workarounds? What I sometimes see arts organizations do is, if you have a primary venue that you use, is to use your company name with the primary venue address. And Google, if it's a bona fide venue, Google understands that there'll be multiple users in the same at the same physical address, right? So it doesn't usually give you too hard a time around that. But as you can see, especially with the map interface, that's all geography, right? And that's like the beginning and end of everything. So it's not, it's not super great for independence in this world. And we have to make choices about how far you're comfortable with that, if that's really your scenario. So in my own case, I've decided I'm comfortable with that, because that is my business address. It's also where I live, and it's not a particularly big secret in the world. So I'm okay with that. That may not be everybody's scenario. So it's useful to think about it for yourselves.
Yeah,
Use your address. Yeah, of course you can. Yeah.
I think that's what Robin is also mentioning, that sort of where's the line of like, will people just show up at your house? But there's other features I've seen, because as you've been explaining, I've been looking on the back end of the Bridges one. I've seemed to have access to that one. So there's a thing where you can say like by appointment, or you can add some more things that would sort of prevent, or you put no open hours. You can put other things that would sort of deter someone from just showing up. But it is still your information. So like, obviously do whatever feels most comfortable for you.
Absolutely. And I mean, and that's all, and I mean, my primary focus in these workshops tends to be how to make the stuff work for you. And I spent very little time being concerned about privacy, because to the most part, we're businesses. Even if you're a sole proprietor, you're a business. It's not actually, my physical address as Strategic Moves is not private information. My physical address as P.A.D.E is private information, right? So in that scenario, we always have to navigate that for ourselves and make our own judgments about that. Absolutely. And make judgments that make sense to you. Okay.
I was just going to say, like, if yeah, the possibility of finding a venue or something, a space or another group that you've worked with, and just using that as your address if you don't want to just use your personal one, because since it's online, it's not, you can sort of put that as an address, and then it can be changed if ever there's a need. It's quite simple. It takes a bit of time for Google to digest it, but I think that is also another option as well. If you've performed somewhere before, you could put that as an option.
Yeah. And speaking of all that nitty-gritty information, I was off my homepage there, and that in that info tab here is the other way to get to it. You see, I have the ability to add hours, to add service areas, to be closed on holidays, whatever, right? This is much more important for retail, right? If you're doing a search for when is Canadian Tire open, most of us just take the Google result for that. We don't actually go to the Canadian Tire website, find the right store in the country, and then check the hours, right? Google actually gives you that answer. For performing arts venues, I find it really adventurous, because many performing arts venues that I work with, they will say that they're open from 9 to 5, which that's their office. But all their shows are from 7 p.m. onwards, but they will actually tell you that they're closed. Very strange. So there's all kinds of little places where you need to make some choices that are actually relevant in your context, right? Just be aware. The other thing that you get to describe, so service area is geography. But then there's also, what are the services you're offering? So again, these are contextual to my business. If you were to if you're a theater company, right, you get to say stuff that is relevant in your context. So if I was a restaurant, it'll ask me stuff about, is it Canadian, is it American, is it Italian, is it pizza, is it fusion, is it a bar, is it a, right? Like all of these categorical things. These are important to fill in terms of whatever is relevant to your thing. What kind of performance would be the question, right? What kind of theater? Because Google starts to use those to relate similar and like pieces of information to each other laterally, right? So if you fill these kinds of things in, your ability to be discovered increases, as opposed to I had to do a search for your particular name. So it's helpful. So you see it, there's quite a lot in this business profile, right? It's free. It costs you nothing to claim. It costs you nothing to feed it and to manage it and to maintain it. It's quite easy. And like I say, the only reason why it's important is because it's a big part of what generates this content on the sidebar. Now, Google being what it is, the reason why this business question mark is here, you can even suggest an edit, right? Is here is because it wants you to feed it information, right? And understand that when you do that, you're only feeding Google as a search engine. You're not feeding any other search engine. If you want to feed other search engines, right, then that's where you go back to, how am I constructing my website? Am I using some of these contemporary ways of constructing my website to optimize them for search, all search, not just Google search? It just so happens that Google accounts for over 90% of all searches, so we tend to focus there. And it's by far the most mature in terms of, from a user standpoint, to generate useful information back to users. People who are massively concerned about their own privacy, they will use other search engines like DuckDuckGo that don't have a lot of those features. So they're not nearly as convenient, but they say they don't actually maintain information about the searches you did. That's what they say anyways. Do I believe that? Do I care? Even less. But that's personal, right? But for those who really do care, that is, there's some alternatives in this world. For our purposes, when 90% of an activity happens on one supplier, right, I'm going to be prone to want to pay attention there. And when they start to generate this kind of powerful view for a user, we know they're going to persist. They're not going to disappear anytime soon, right? So that's why we focus here, right? If in a year from now somebody else is, way more powerful, that's where I'll go. I'm quite agnostic to whatever the tool is. Does this make some sense in terms of trying to figure out how to use Google for good for your purposes?
I just see a couple of questions, and if anybody else has any, please don't hesitate to just jump in. Eileen has asked, will the singing business and the festival business show up as the same address on maps?
Yeah, they will. Of course they will. There's tons of buildings, like, I don't know, your local mall, right? Every business in your local mall would be showing up with the same physical address. There's no issue with that. If they have multiple locations, because I don't know, there's some kind of a chain, they'll also show up with their other locations across the country or the world or whatever it is, or Southern Ontario. So that's completely fine. Yes, they will.
And then the other one is that, I guess it's like following up on that from Robin, I guess that Google will link them. So if you search one, the other will also get mentioned. I think my hypothesis is that if you will Google the address, then they might both come up. But if you're looking for puppetry, one would be favored. And if you're looking for singing, the other would be favored. That's my hypothesis.
That's a very good hypothesis. That's exactly how that works. Yes. And so there's two ways to search, right? Like if I'm looking for, I don't know, if I'm just doing a search for theaters near me, theaters in Toronto, why don't we do that? You get a result that looks like this, right? And then I'll say, oh, okay, I really just meant downtown Toronto. So I'm now zooming into the downtown stuff. And now I'm at the Royal Alexandra. Great. So I'm going to click on the Royal. I just clicked on the hot link on the side here. Okay. I didn't click on the map. I clicked on the hot link on the side because as you saw, as I zoomed in, that stuff gets updated, right? It's dynamic. So now I'm at the Royal Alexandra. You see this here, that's your knowledge panel, right? It gets used, it's completely integrated with maps. You see how that worked? So it's very powerful because what am I not doing right now? I'm not on the Royal Alexandra Theatre website. I'm getting a tremendous amount of information in a really pleasing, fast, quick to understand way, right? Here. And I'm still on Google. So that's one of the things that Google has figured out is how to be that kind of persistent, where they're able to serve relevant information very quickly to users, but they're actually bypassing the user going to your website or the user going to your Facebook, right? And here I in fact can get a whole bunch of events. So if I look at this and I say, oh, I want to go to Come From Away, great, 25 more. I want to find a date that makes sense to me. I just clicked on this go more. And what am I in now? You see this really funny screen with all these events at the top. I am now seamlessly in the Google Events engine. So you know when you do a search for what's on tonight, what's on this weekend, events in Toronto on Saturday night, and you do that search on Google, you get a page that looks like this, and you're in the events engine. So that's right. You see how seamless this is. And because I'm gonna click on, oh, I would like to go on Tuesday the 21st, solstice and all. And I just clicked on that. I get that contextual event right here. And now I get, you know, my tickets and all that should be pretty seamlessly going into this. Come From Away tickets on sale through January 2022. And it's loading. And now I'm finally on the event website, right? But I've made a whole pile of decisions already without being on their website. That's one of the tricky things about how Google behaves now, right? Because Google gives you answers, which is qualitatively different from Google simply giving you search results, right? The search result would be the blue stuff over here on the side. The Crane Theatre Company Knowledge Panel, that's actually an answer, right? And it can be very satisfying. So I can get all of that without ever clicking on Crane, right? And I mean, if I click on Crane, I'll get something like this, and that's pleasing too, right? You got a bunch of, there's your event, Terror, interactive courtroom drama. There we go. And that's on your homepage right now. It makes a lot of sense, right? Is this helping to sort of understand a little bit about how to use this stuff and make it more powerful for you?
I have a couple more questions in the chat. We can keep
Okay.
with those.
Yeah, please.
Andrea is asking how to keep up with Google algorithm changes. Any strategies for that would be super helpful.
Okay, well, good luck. Keeping up with the algorithm itself is super difficult. It changes every single day, just like with Facebook. So I tend to not want to focus on, you know, the minute changes in the algorithm. There is a thing called Search Console, Google Search Console. And if you want to get deep into how stuff works, you can sign up for services that are paid services that help you understand how those algorithms change. If you were a multi-million-dollar multinational company, I'd highly recommend that. But your capacity will never allow you to keep up with that stuff. And your traffic is probably not in the millions. So the differences you will see for the effort that requires, you'd never be able to see it if you have, you know, 10,000 visitors a year. So from a scale standpoint, it doesn't make sense to want to go there, but there are tools that cost a little bit of money that track that stuff in the sort of minute ways. The things I tend to focus on with arts organizations is what we're talking about today, right? Which is to understand how Google sees you on search, which is to understand how Google constructs its knowledge panel for you and the sources of information for it. And that if you fill in all that stuff, it becomes very powerful for you. Okay. And in particular, if you can figure out how to tie your events together. So I just want to click on the bridges thing here. I just clicked on bridges events there. I'm going to click it from here and I see at what point do I get the event? I don't. It just goes back and forth between the two. That's cool. Okay, here's what I want to show you. Sorry, I'm just going to try to make this a bit bigger. You see what the source is here? So we're clicked on the bridges under events, right, in the knowledge panel. And what I'm getting is this little event card right here. And see what the source is. It's not Crane Theater Productions. Why is that?
Go ahead.
We are doing quite a lot of inbound listings so that we get traffic from other sites. So this is
Very
one
smart.
of the listings.
Very smart. Yes, you want that. So the reason why it shows up and your site doesn't is because they use a thing called structured data on their website. They use machine readable, there's a few ways to describe that. One is structured data, another one is machine readable data, and a third one is semantic markup, or sometimes we call it structured metadata markup. Those are all the same things. Your site doesn't use that clearly for those events. That's why they show up and you don't, even though your event shows up. This also happens, like, I don't know, if we're doing a quick search for what's on in Mississauga. So this is really important. So I should tell you, we're not spending a ton of time on structured data today, but in our next series of workshops, we're looking at advanced search engine optimization, and we're looking at machine readable data in the first couple of sessions. So both of those will enlighten us on how to do that if we want to do it. Meanwhile, what happens is this piece, I want to say a little bit about this Google Events thing today, but I'm not going to go into like massive depth on it. I just want to explain to you a little bit about how this works. So I'm right now in a search result for, I didn't do a search for events on Google. I did a search for what's on in Mississauga, the kind of search that, regular users might do, right? I'm just trying to figure out what to do this weekend, basically. But I end up in the Google Events engine, which lists a whole pile of events with more or less strange rhyme or reason. Like you'll notice, for instance, that they're not in order by date. And they're not in order by location in a way that I could recognize either. But if I scroll down here, at some point, terror, that's your event, isn't it? So if I click on that, I'm not going to your website, I'm going to the next layer down, right? This the second piece that showed up here. And you see the event, Ontario event directory is the information and tickets for your event. Does that make any sense to you, Amy? Do you know who they are?
Yeah, it's one of the listing sites we've put, and we actually were, because we were looking at the homework before this call, before the meeting, and we were looking at this, and we were, I put the event on this website, and then we were seeing if there was a way for us to get them to change the image to be our image, but then we're like looking it back, it's not a feature that they offer for a free listing. So
right. So these images that are sitting here, are they like in my result? Are they reasonable images?
They're images from that website, but they don't.
Right. So they don't relate to you at all, right?
No.
Okay. So that's one of the liabilities that you end up with when you. So it's a good interim. Like it takes a little bit of effort to implement structured data for your events on your website. Not a lot, but a little, right? So the interim options are you use Facebook events, you have the venue, sometimes has, venue listings can account for that. Your ticket agent might account for that. Or these event calendars account for that. The challenge is you're not 100% in charge. Right? So you end up with this kind of slight discontinuity where the image on top, like a lot of that is correct. Like the map would be correct. That would probably be the event menu, right? But the images related are not about your show, and you don't have a way of changing that. So that's always the thing with when you're not fully in charge, what happens. The other thing is that the information that I'm getting comes from their directory site. So you want to make sure when you use those that the description is complete. Right? Because you now begin to understand that people are making the decision to attend your show without going to your website. They do it based on this stuff. And these are the images that show up, and they're not yours. No kidding, they're not yours. Let's see, do we get a ticket link here somewhere?
There's one just higher up website link right in the middle of the page. There's the 3 blue lines and right below.
This right here?
Yes.
Funny how none of that is hot.
Mm-hmm.
That just seems to be an error. Sorry, I'm just trying to go there. Leave. Excuse my email. And all that happens is, of course, right. Sorry, I put that in the wrong spot. I put that in my search, of course. Okay, now I'm having a crappy experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because I mean,
All those
you see all the steps that you just put me through inadvertently. Right, that's not ideal. Let me just see what happens when we click on the childlife.ca here. That's in March. That's great. That seems like I mean, I'm not reading it, but it seems there's a bunch of words there. That's great. Visit the event website. That's nice. Let's just see what happens when we do that. You get your March Break Festival coming up. It's just loading for a second there. So my ideal scenario, a user's ideal scenario, I should say. Sorry, let me go back to what's on. See web results. Okay, I don't want to do that. What I want to find is an event that has a whole bunch of, sorry, just give me a second. I'm just looking for one where the site itself might actually, all events. Yeah, you see, you keep seeing what shows up under information and tickets, right? It comes off the event engines, which is great. At least you show up this way, right? Like I wouldn't knock that. It just means that some of those event engines are scraping your content, and some of those event engines you actually add your content. So it's worthwhile for you to keep track of that until you implement structured data, which we'll talk about in January on your own site. Because what you really ideally get here is, because it says more information and tickets, for people who set this up as a single seamless thing, you can get to the ticket sale without ever having been to your website. And that at this point in time, you know, you see the runarounds that I end up with in your scenario. They're not unusual runarounds where I ended up, you know, I get the Google Events result, I click on some stuff, I'm not really getting the thing I'm looking for, but I get the event, and all kinds of really strange things have happened, right? Like I'm clicking a whole bunch of times without getting a satisfying result. And whenever we put people through that, that generates opportunities to say no, right? And what we're really after is for people to get to yes as quickly as possible, right? Andrea, your hands up.
Yes, I do. And one of the challenges with that is that stuff like all events, for example, it's a scraping website,
Yep.
like you mentioned.
Yep.
And the issue is because some of these are basically websites that rely on click farms.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
so they have massive traffic, because we had this problem with our first Bridges Festival 2 years ago, when we had a site that we ended up on with wrong pictures, wrong information, wrong everything. And we had to pursue them for like 2 weeks to even get the listings down, because it was hurting the listing. But because they're pushed up by click farms, they always list first, no matter how much you try.
So Google is a bit smarter than that. at the same time though. So Google defaults to trusted websites whenever possible. The most trusted website would be your own. But because you don't use structured data yet on your site, you don't show up at all, right? And so it is a thing, like you have an opportunity to get to that, and to implement that. And that would start to change. Like one of the things that would start to change is that your the information about you. I'm just going to find an NAC event here, hopefully. Search for more events. I want to find a National Arts Center event of some sort. Carly Rae Jepsen. Let's try that. So even the NAC hasn't figured this out fully, by the way. They've been a client of mine for 15 years. I know them well, so I'll knock them for a second here. But they use Ticketmaster is one of their sources. To do Canada, not really. Ticket Smarter, not really. Festivaly.eu, it's Europe, right? So you see how this is not an ideal result for them either, right? And this in part happens because they're not fully leveraging structured data for their events, right? But if I click on Ticketmaster from here, I should get to the actual event. I agree, that's fine. I should get to the actual event for that thing. That's ultimately what you're after, right? Is to follow this, I can locate my event. And again, like 4 of these choices are not useful for the NAC either that you're seeing here in terms of information and tickets. But I happen to know that Ticketmaster is their agent. So when I click on that, I go directly to the buying. This is becoming the expectations users have, not the strange runaround, right? So, and the challenge is whenever you're not in charge. So the only thing you're truly in charge is the things that you put yourself online. So if the scraper engines are getting in the way, you can't really eliminate them. All you can do is make sure that your content is machine readable and follows these kind of standards, right? And that you elevate your own content. And the other thing you can do is that for those engines that you proactively use, right? You might say, oh, that event engine in my town, often it's the newspapers, right? And they're using structured data now, so they end up showing up above you too. But that you actually have complete event listings there, not just a title and a web page, but the actual write-up. And sometimes they allow you to add an image and sometimes they don't. So when they don't, you're in the shits, right? but those are ways to triage that at least. And that's part of my purpose, right? Is to help us understand where the weaknesses are in terms of what you're doing right now and where the opportunities are. Does that help some? Okay. Like what I'm after is to empower you in this process. And it's a process that you're not fully in charge of, right? Because you have algorithms, you have choices. I should tell you that Eventbrite, if some of you might still be using Eventbrite, Eventbrite was one of the first partners that Google worked with around events. So all Eventbrite listings are completely optimized to show up here. And again, the only challenge is make sure that you fully duplicate the listing in Eventbrite then, right? Which you can actually. They have a lot of features and functions within their engine because they make a little bit of money too. So if you're using for ticketing, there's an exchange there that happens. So they're more interested in making it work for you than maybe an allevents.in or IO would be, right? Is that good? Other questions, comments?
There's a couple of things from Robin.
Robin.
If things are at the same address, would Google try to mention those other business items that are in the same location, maybe at the bottom of the knowledge panel or elsewhere in the search engine somehow?
It might, yep, absolutely. Because it relates, right? So Google wouldn't only use the address, like, if I have a dentist and a theater company in the same building, the only thing they have in common is that they're at the same building. So Google would default to content more than geography in that case. It would say, oh, are there, like if I'm looking for a dentist, are there other dentists in that vicinity? And it would be more prone to show you other dentists, like the content you're after, than simply saying, oh, it's just a physical address I care about. Similarly, in terms of events, if I'm doing an actual search for events, it's going to show me other events, not necessarily arts organizations. So you see sometimes an event is associated to a venue, and the venue may have the same name as the organization, or it may be not, right? Like in the case of Eileen's company, you're using venues other than your own office. So the organization is completely separate from a venue. Google distinguishes between those two quite well. Like a theater is not a theater. A theater could be a producing company, or it could be a presenting venue, right?
The next question, which Robin has, is also one that I'm curious about. My expectation is to find the actual site of the thing or the event.
Yes.
And not necessarily bypassing the actual page, if that's what it's doing. And I guess my addition to that is like, because we could basically have people avoiding our website on purpose, you know, to go directly to the ticket link right away on Eventbrite, for example, versus just linking them to our website, which has more information, and then linking them to Eventbrite. So which one would be, because on the one hand, we want traffic on the website, but the other hand, we want them to have the simplest, best experience as the user as well.
It's no longer up to you,
Mm-hmm.
would be my quick answer to you, right? Users will, because it's up to the user, right? So so part of why I'm showing this stuff to you in terms of how Google really operates is Google does this because it works for Google and the users, right? Google cares a little bit less about, you know, sending people to your website than Google cares about getting the user to have a successful experience. Robin, is that a useful way to express that for you? Google is not in the business anymore of sending people to your website. Google is not in the search business. Google is in the business of organizing the world's information for users. That's the business they're in. Okay, so their interests are not the same as yours. Right? So as soon as Google started doing this event stuff the way they're doing it, right, your challenge changed. Your challenge used to be to have a really easy to use website that gets people to your events as quickly as possible, but also prepares them for the experience of what that event is in some fashion, right? You're setting expectations for what they're going to be experiencing. So whenever people get to yes without having a full understanding, that can create some really strange audiences, right? Gee, I thought it was one thing, but it's another. I didn't realize there were puppets in that theater piece because they never saw the image of the damn puppets, right? Because that's not on the listing site or the ticket site anymore. So it really does challenge us as website owners and event producers to understand that if this is the experience, my task is now to position my content in this experience. Because you're absolutely right. My next step is to simply click on one of these sources, and I might be ending up on a reseller site. Who knows where I'm here, right? Because you saw that, you know, for this particular event, there's like, really, none of these are the Ticketmaster kind of type sites. They, like, I don't know who they are, but they're the ones showing up when I'm looking for the Ottawa Senators against the Canucks. This is a hockey game I'm now on, right? I know all this information up here is correct. Read more on Fox Sports is their reference. How fascinating. So again, right, because the NHL probably doesn't have to care so much, I will find their games now usually sell out, whatever, I'm not worried about it. But from your standpoint, you don't want these discontinuous, you know, all of a sudden authoritative sites. What Google has decided is authoritative about your thing show up like that. You would like this to be whatever your company is should be providing that piece of text, but the only way to get there is by structuring your data. Right. And in the meantime, can you do some things to look better here? I think there's, you know, certainly Facebook is a great source, Eventbrite, that was kind of luck, but those two, many of us would use in the arts. And those two do really well. Facebook usually shows up if you use Facebook events, and you'll end up, however, on the Facebook listing, right, for this thing. And then, somewhere, hopefully there is a ticket thing I can click on at some point. Yeah, I'd have to look a little harder than I am right now. But that's sort of like, that's your other option, is if you use Facebook events, that can help you, at least you're in charge of what shows up here. Okay, so those are interim steps in a way to actually fully implementing structured data on your own site.
Aditi has her hand raised. Maybe a question.
Hi.
Hi. Do you want to unmute? And then sorry, I'm right beside Amy.
So one of you has to shut it off so we don't hear the feedback.
Sorry. Okay. Basically, Eventbrite has the ability also to embed their events onto your web page. So would it be in our favor to kind of, since Google is no longer giving a priority to send people to your website and rather wants them to have the fastest experience to purchase the ticket, to kind of bypass that a little bit by making the event on Eventbrite so that it goes onto the Google? However, is there a potential way to link our website with the Eventbrite event embedded into our own web page so that they purchase it from Eventbrite, however, the view comes to our website?
I would experiment with that. Whenever you're, so I think my answer right now is that's actually a really intuitive solution to some of this, because it avoids duplication. You don't have to have the listing on your website and on Eventbrite and on Facebook, right? You can't just put it in one place that is authoritative, that has a huge partnership with Google, and you say, I'm just gonna do that. I'm gonna save myself a bunch of time and a bunch of confusion on the audience side, basically. I think that's intuitive. I think that's well worthwhile experimenting with. What I want to point out, though, is that every time that we put our trust and faith into another company's web behaviors that we're not in charge of, they may make a decision at some point that doesn't serve you. Facebook is notorious for this, right? Facebook makes changes on the fly all the time, massively different user experience. If you commit to their thing, like that's one of the reasons why I don't recommend that people think that their Facebook presence could function as their website, because you're not in charge of what happens to it. They move stuff around, they change user experience, right? You're just not in charge of it. So Eventbrite isn't nearly as risky as a Facebook, but you're not in charge of it. So be aware that when they're making changes, right, you would need to stay ahead of that. You need to be abreast of that, and to make sure that, that connection actually works for you. Is it worth experimenting with that? Totally. Because I mean, you don't have a ton of resources to do the same thing 5 times, right? That's part of your challenge here. So I think it is worthwhile, and I would have more trust in Eventbrite than I would in Facebook. There is that, right? So, but it is the statement I just made is a statement of trust, not a statement of fact. So be aware, right? I'm applying my own judgment based on my web experience, as you would, right?
We are just about at time. Oh, sorry. And there's just a couple of last questions in the chat here. My expectation is to, oh no, sorry, I already read that one. My event uses Bookwen for ticket sales. Should we make a Facebook event page for each event to get noticed by Google, since it seems to show up well?
Yeah, especially if the ticket agent you're using does not, because they're not using structured data. You would know it. Like if you search for your events on Google and you see what comes up, you'll see it if it's there or not, right? You can also do we'll talk about that in January. You can also do you can do a check on any website to figure out whether they have structured data on their site. It's just takes 2 seconds. It's a little utility that you use to figure that out definitively. So if they don't, Facebook events is a good stopgap to get you there. Absolutely. As might be a local newspaper. Don't knock those guys. As long as you can actually have a complete listing there, including an image, without having to pay for it in particular, that's really nice. But those are good solutions to get you into the playing field in terms of how Google eliminates you if you don't show up when I do my search for what's on this weekend. Because that's a liability, right? Not showing up is the worst part. And if none of the things you use show up, then you just dropped off my radar completely. I will not know that you're doing anything this weekend or next month or next year. So briefly, this is the content that is covered in the PowerPoint. Like there's a presentation behind this, which is shared on, I think it's on the website already probably, which is shared. So you do have a reference for that, even though the workshop itself is all done by basically sharing my screen with you and trying to show you some of that stuff live. So those are memory aids basically you get to use when you're trying to sort of go back to say, what was she on to with that? We also have a session on Saturday to review a bunch of stuff together. So bring your questions, bring things that have defeated you, or where you kind of go like, I'm not sure what that's really all about, and can you explain it again? So anything that we've done over those 4 workshops is fair game. And then next year, we're starting off with machine readable information and how to do that on your own site and how to triage that and how to help you figure out how to do that in the easiest possible way. And the easiest possible way depends a little bit on what kind of website infrastructure you're using. Do you have a WordPress site? Do you have a Wix site? Is it a custom build? There's implications for how easy or not easy it is to implement structured data, basically. So we'll cover that in the new year. There you go.
Awesome. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to Canada Council for the Arts for their support on these workshops. Please feel free to visit the website link that I've shared in the chat. It has all the materials from this workshop as well as the previous ones if you wanted to go over anything we've talked about, and then join us on Saturday for a little working session where we can actually, talk about the practical things. If anyone is trying stuff and is having a hard time, bring that in on Saturday and we'll be happy to see if we can figure it out together.
Awesome.
Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you on Saturday, or we'll see you in the new year.